The air in the Whispering Pines Ranger Station was thick with the kind of silence that only comes at the end of a long season. It was a comfortable quiet, one I'd grown used to over the past 5 months, but now it felt heavy, a countdown timer ticking away the seconds until I could go home. I picked up the framed photo from the corner of my cluttered desk. Olivia's smile was the same one that had hooked me in college, and 7-year-old Chloe's was a perfect gapped-tooth copy. My girls. Another 2 weeks, I told the photo. Just 14 more days of this green-dripping world, and I'd be back in our warm, dry house in Medford. The scent of pine and stale coffee hung in the room, a perfume I wouldn't miss. Outside the window, a light drizzle was starting to bead on the glass, blurring the monolithic forms of the Douglas firs that crowded the station on all sides. They stood like ancient moss-covered sentinels, their tops lost in the low-hanging gray sky. This late in September, the Umpqua National Forest was emptying out, the last of the hardcore campers and hikers packing up before the real autumn rains turned the trails to mud. The station door slammed open, ripping the silence to shreds. Finn stood there, dripping on the welcome mat, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His uniform was rumpled, his hair plastered to his forehead, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. "I don't believe it," he spat, kicking a loose chunk of mud from his boot. "I just don't freaking believe it. The Portland Beavers, a 2-run lead in the bottom of the 9th. Who blows a 2-run lead in the bottom of the 9th? I leaned back in my chair, setting the photo down gently. "Let me guess. You bet the farm on them?" "Not the farm," he muttered, stalking over to the coffee pot and pouring the sludgy remains into a mug. "But enough to make this a very, very long week. It's my luck, Cal. It's in the toilet. A complete cold streak." "Finn, we've talked about this," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Marcus will have your hide if he catches you gambling on the clock again. You know the rules." He waved a dismissive hand, the gesture jerky and agitated. "It's not just the sports book, man. It's everything. The poker game with the guys from the fire crew last week? I lost $150. My car payment is due. I'm trying to catch a break." He took a long, noisy slurp of coffee and grimaced. "This tastes like battery acid." I felt a familiar pang of concern for him. Finn was a good ranger, one of the best I'd worked with. He knew these woods as well as I did, but his demons were all of his own making. The gambling had started as a bit of fun a few years back, but now it was a constant gnawing pressure that was visibly wearing him down. He was always chasing a loss, always one big win away from being square. "A break isn't going to come from a long shot bet," I said. "You just dig yourself deeper." "Easy for you to say," he shot back, his voice edged with resentment. "You've got the perfect little family, the savings account. You're not one bad hand away from—" He trailed off, shaking his head as he stared out the window into the deepening gloom. Forget it. Before I could reply, the intercom on my desk crackled to life, Marcus's gruff voice filling the room. "Cal, Finn, conference room. Now, all hands." We exchanged a look. All hands meant trouble. We trudged down the hall to the small, wood-paneled conference room where the other 3 rangers on duty were already gathered. A large television was mounted on the wall, tuned to a Portland news station. Marcus stood beside it, his arms crossed, his face grim. He was a barrel-chested man who'd spent 30 years with the Park Service, and not much rattled him. Whatever this was, it was big. On the screen, a meteorologist was gesturing frantically at a swirling, monstrous satellite image off the Oregon coast. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Cyclone Anya intensifies to Category 3. Mandatory evacuations issued for coastal counties. It's moving faster than they predicted, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the reporter's urgent babble. It's expected to make landfall in less than 24 hours. They're calling for gale force winds and flash flooding even this far inland. We're officially closing the park, effective immediately. He unrolled a large topographical map of the forest and pinned it to the corkboard. It was crisscrossed with grids and colored lines, a familiar patchwork of our jurisdiction. The mission is simple, he continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Find and evacuate. I want every campsite, every trail, every lookout point swept. I don't want a single soul left in this park when that thing hits. Davies, you and O'Neill take the eastern sectors. Hit the Diamond Lake campgrounds first. Miller, you've got the southern river trails. He tapped a large, remote section of the map shaded in dark green. Cal, Finn, you two get Sector Gamma. It's the furthest out and the wildest. Not many people go up there this time of year, but we can't take chances. There are a few old logging roads and unmarked trails. I want them checked. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Sector Gamma. It was a sprawling 30-square-mile chunk of wilderness where the trails faded to deer paths and the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun even on a clear day. Radio comms are spotty up there, Marcus warned, as if reading my mind. You'll have the truck's long-range unit at the trailhead, but once you're on foot, you'll only have your handhelds to talk to each other. Check in when you can. Now gear up and get moving. The clock is ticking. We all nodded. The casual, end-of-season atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a cold, professional urgency. As we filed out, Finn clapped me on the shoulder, a forced, hollow smile on his face. Sector Gamma, huh? He said. Maybe our luck's about to change. I looked out the window at the swaying pines and the sky that was now the color of a fresh bruise. For some reason, his words didn't feel reassuring. They felt like a premonition. The pickup's tires crunched over the wet gravel, the engine's growl a lonely sound in the vast, encroaching wilderness. Finn was at the wheel, his knuckles white on the steering column as he navigated the slick, winding Forest Service road. I watched the world outside my window become progressively wilder, the neat rows of replanted trees giving way to a primeval chaos of ancient timber. Giant Douglas firs, some over 200 feet tall, formed a cathedral of giants on either side of the road. Their bark was dark with rain, and thick emerald green moss hung from their boughs like the beards of old men. The air that seeped through the truck's vents was heavy and cold, thick with the scent of pine needles and rich, damp earth. Above us, the sky was a churning sea of leaden clouds, promising a deluge. The storm was coming. I could feel it in the barometric pressure, a heavy weight pressing down on the world. "You call Olivia yet?" Finn asked, breaking the silence. His eyes were fixed on the road. "Yeah, from the station," I said. "Told her I'd be off-grid for a while. She wasn't happy about the storm, but she gets it. It's the job." I thought of her voice, tight with worry, and Chloe in the background asking when Daddy was coming home. The thought was a dull ache in my chest. "Must be nice," Finn muttered, so low I barely heard him. An hour later, the road ended abruptly at a small, muddy clearing that served as the trailhead for Sector Gamma. A single faded signpost leaned crookedly, pointing in two different directions: North Ridge Trail and Elk Creek Loop. This was as far as the truck could take us. "All right," I said, pulling on my heavy-duty rain gear. "Here's the plan. We cover more ground if we split up. I'll take North Ridge. You take Elk Creek." The trails run roughly parallel for the first few miles before branching out. We'll sweep our assigned areas and meet back here in, say, 4 hours? Finn nodded, checking the load in his own pack. Sounds good. No campers, no hikers. We're back here in 2. Radio check, I said, pulling my handheld from my belt. The small device felt solid and reassuring in my hand. I switched to our designated channel. Whispering Pines Base, this is Ranger 1. Do you copy? Static. I tried again. Base, this is Ranger 1. Radio check over. More static, punctuated by a faint, garbled voice that was impossible to decipher. As Marcus had warned, we were in a dead zone, cocooned by the dense forest and rolling hills. No signal to base, I said to Finn. Truck units our only link out of here. I switched channels. Ranger 2, you read me? Finn's radio crackled instantly. Loud and clear, Ranger 1. It's just you and me, buddy. Okay, stick to the channel. Report in every 30 minutes. If you find anyone, radio me, and I'll head to your position. If you run into trouble you can't handle, you fire your flare. Same goes for me, understood? Understood, he confirmed, his voice all business now. The gambler was gone, replaced by the ranger. See you in a few hours, Cal. Try not to get eaten by a cougar. You too, I said with a thin smile. We gave each other a final nod and turned away, 2 small figures swallowed by the immense silent woods. The Northridge Trail was a narrow ribbon of dark earth snaking its way up a steep incline. The ground was soft and spongy under my boots, a carpet of fallen needles and decaying leaves. The only sounds were the drip of water from the ferns that lined the path and the steady sigh of the wind high above in the canopy. It was a lonely, desolate sound. The air grew colder as I climbed. The forest was eerily empty. No birdsong, no chattering of squirrels. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. After about 45 minutes of steady hiking, the wind began to pick up in earnest. It was no longer a sigh, but a roar, a physical force that whipped through the trees, making the massive trunks groan and sway. Rain began to fall, not a drizzle anymore, but a hard, stinging downpour. I pulled my hood tighter, blinking water from my eyes as I scanned the woods on either side of the trail. Nothing. No tents, no campfire smoke, no sign of human life. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a sound of the forest. It was a mechanical drone, a strained, whining noise that grew rapidly louder, fighting against the howl of the wind. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the rain. Through a gap in the canopy, I saw it. A small, twin-engine plane, flying dangerously low. It wasn't a Forest Service spotter plane or a commercial jet. It was smaller, sleeker, painted a dark, non-reflective gray. It was in trouble. One of its propellers was sputtering, and a thin trail of black smoke streamed behind it. As I watched, the plane's wing dipped sharply. It seemed to hang in the air for a heart-stopping second before it banked violently, its engine screaming in a final, agonizing protest. It disappeared behind the crest of the next ridge, the sound cut off by an earth-shaking crump that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Silence followed, a profound and sudden void where the engine noise had been. My training kicked in, adrenaline overriding the shock. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers slick with rain. "Finn, Ranger 2, come in. Do you copy?" The radio hissed. "Finn, talk to me. Did you see that?" A burst of static, then his voice, tinny and laced with disbelief. "Jesus, Cal, I saw it. I saw the smoke. It went down somewhere over the ridge from you, didn't it?" "Affirmative," I said, my voice tight. "It looked like it came down hard, maybe a mile and a half east of my current position. I'm heading there now." "What about the sweep? The sweep is over. A plane crash is a priority 1 emergency. Get back to the truck, Finn. Now. Get on the long range and call it in. Tell Marcus there's a crash in Sector Gamma, unknown number of souls on board. Request immediate search and rescue, air support if they can fly in this weather. You are to stay at the truck and coordinate with base. That's an order. There was a pause, just the sound of the wind and rain over the radio. Roger that, Cal, Finn said finally. I haven't seen a soul on my trail. It's a ghost town out here. I'll get back to the truck and make the call. Soon as I've raised Marcus, I'm coming for you. Negative, Ranger 2. Your orders are to wait at the vehicle. You're our only link to the outside world. Don't break it. I'll handle the initial approach and report back what I find. Cal, be careful, he said, his voice strained. That plane looked shady as hell. I'm always careful, I replied, already pushing my way off the trail, heading east into the untracked wilderness. Ranger 1, over and out. The trek to the crash site was a brutal, disorienting ordeal. There was no trail here, just a tangled labyrinth of dripping undergrowth, fallen logs slick with moss, and steep, muddy ravines. The rain was relentless, plastering my hair to my scalp and seeping into the collar of my jacket. Every step was a struggle against the sucking mud and whipping branches. The only thing guiding me was the thin wisp of smoke I'd seen and the acrid smell of burnt fuel that now tainted the pine-scented air. After what felt like an eternity, I crested a small rise and saw it. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. The plane had carved a terrifying path through the forest, a scar of snapped and splintered Douglas firs nearly 100 yards long. The wreckage itself was a mangled heap of metal, half buried in the churned-up earth. One wing was sheared clean off, wrapped around the trunk of an ancient tree. The fuselage was buckled and torn open like a tin can, and a lazy curl of black smoke still rose from the crumpled nose. My heart pounded against my ribs. I was trained for this, for first response. Assess the scene, look for survivors, render aid. I slid down the muddy embankment, my boots sinking into the soft ground. That's when I saw the bodies. There were 2 of them, lying on the ground near the fuselage where a side door had been torn from its hinges. They were men, dressed in dark clothing. At first I assumed they'd been thrown clear in the impact. But as I drew closer, a cold dread, heavy and sickening, washed over me. This was no ordinary crash. I forced myself to look, my ranger training battling the primal urge to turn and run. The first man lay on his back, his eyes wide with a terror that death hadn't erased. A massive, ragged crater had been scooped out of his neck and shoulder, a horrific wound that went clear to the bone. It wasn't a cut or a puncture. It looked like a piece of him had been bitten off. By what I couldn't imagine. His face and chest were covered in deep parallel gouges, as if he'd been clawed by something with razors for talons. Bile rose in my throat, hot and acidic. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively going to the Glock 19 holstered at my hip. I took a few deep breaths, fighting to control the nausea. I had to be professional. I had to assess. The second man was a few feet away, crumpled against a log. His injuries were just as grotesque. A huge chunk of flesh was torn from his thigh, the white of his femur gleaming wetly in the gray light. The same horrific claw marks raked across his abdomen, his shirt shredded to bloody ribbons. This wasn't a crash scene. This was a slaughter. Something had attacked these men. Something huge and vicious. A bear. A cougar. I'd seen what both could do, and this was worse. Far worse. The sheer violence of the wounds was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. My senses were screaming at me. Every shadow in the dripping forest seemed to hold a threat. The wind whistling through the broken fuselage sounded like a hungry snarl. With my pistol drawn, the cold metal a small comfort in my trembling hand, I forced myself to move towards the plane. I had to know if anyone else was on board. I had to know what had done this. The interior of the plane was a scene of utter chaos. Seats were torn from their moorings, wires dangled from the ceiling, and personal effects were strewn everywhere. But it was the cargo that caught my eye. Scattered across the floor were several wooden crates, their lids stenciled with Spanish words I didn't recognize. One of them had burst open in the crash. From the splintered wood spilled dozens of plastic-wrapped packages, each about the size of a brick. A fine white powder dusted the floor around them. Cocaine. A lot of it. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a plane crash. It was a cartel smuggling flight. And Finn was right. It was shady as hell. These weren't victims. They were drug runners. My eyes scanned the rest of the cabin, moving past the illicit cargo to the rear of the aircraft. And that's where I found it. It was a cage. A massive, heavy-duty cage, bolted to the floor of the plane. It was big enough to hold a grizzly bear, constructed of what looked like welded steel rebar. But it was empty. And the door, a solid slab of steel with a heavy slide bolt, was not open. It was bent outwards, the thick steel bars warped and twisted as if by some incredible, impossible force. Several of the rebar lengths were snapped clean through, the brakes glinting with fresh, sharp metal. Whatever was in that cage, it had gotten out. And it had been powerful enough to tear its way through solid steel. A new, more potent fear pierced through my adrenaline-fueled shock. It was a cold, sharp dread that settled deep in my bones. The thing that had mauled the men outside, it had been the cargo. My gaze dropped to the muddy floor of the cabin, and there, amidst the debris and the drugs, I saw them. Footprints. 2 distinct sets of boot prints, different from the ones on the dead men. They led from the cockpit area, past the broken crate, and out the ripped-open fuselage door, heading away from the crash and deeper into the forest. Survivors. At least 2 of them. But it was what I saw beside their tracks that made my breath catch in my chest. Pressed deep into the mud were other prints. They were huge, far larger than any bear track I'd ever seen. They were long and vaguely canine, but the shape was wrong, the toes too long, the claws leaving deep, sharp impressions in the earth. It was the track of a predator that had no right to exist in these woods, or anywhere else on Earth. 2 sets of human tracks, fleeing, and 1 set of monstrous tracks following them. I had to warn Finn. I had to warn Marcus, but my radio was useless here. The survivors, they were the only other people who knew what was out here, and it was hunting them. I looked from the carnage at my feet to the tracks disappearing into the dark, rain-swept trees. My choice was a simple, terrible one. I had to follow. The sky opened up. What had been a hard rain became a torrential downpour, a solid wall of water that blurred the world into a wash of gray and green. The sun had dipped below the ridges, plunging the forest into a deep, claustrophobic twilight. I pulled the hood of my slicker down tight, but the cold rain found its way down my neck anyway, a chilling trickle against my skin. The tracks were turning to soup. The distinct outlines of the boot prints and the monstrous paw marks were melting into muddy, indistinguishable depressions. I was losing the trail. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drum beat against the roar of the wind and rain. Every few minutes, I'd stop, listen, and try my radio, my thumb pressing the transmit button in a useless, hopeful ritual. "Finn, do you copy? Finn, come in, damn it." The only reply was the angry hiss of static. The storm was swallowing the signal completely. I was alone out here, cut off, hunting for two desperate men while being hunted myself by the thing that had been in that cage. The thought was a cold knot of dread in my gut. What was I going to do when I found them? What could my 9mm pistol do against a creature that could tear through a steel cage and rip a man apart with its teeth? A sound cut through the storm's fury. It was a scream, a human scream, high-pitched and ragged with pure terror. It came from somewhere ahead of me, maybe 100 yards through the dense thicket. It was followed by a panicked string of Spanish. Adrenaline surged through me, hot and sharp. I pushed through a wall of wet ferns, my pistol held out in front of me in a two-handed grip. "I'm a park ranger!" I yelled, my voice sounding thin against the storm. "I'm here to help!" I burst into a small clearing, a mossy, rock-strewn space. A man was there, scrambling backward on his hands and knees, his eyes wide with animal panic. He was one of the survivors from the plane. He saw me, saw the uniform and the badge on my sleeve, and a flicker of desperate hope crossed his face. He pointed a trembling finger into the darkness behind him. "Hombre lobo!" he gasped, the words barely audible. "El diablo!" "Man wolf! The devil!" He scrambled to his feet and lurched toward me, trying to hide behind my body as if I were a shield. He kept looking over my shoulder, his face a mask of primal fear. "No, no, no," he babbled, his terror infectious. Then I heard it, a rustling in the undergrowth that wasn't caused by the wind, a heavy, deliberate movement. Something was circling us, staying just inside the curtain of rain and shadows. "Get behind that rock!" I shouted at the man, shoving him toward a large, moss-covered boulder. "Stay down!" I raised my pistol, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was everywhere at once. A rustle to my left, a snapped twig to my right. It was impossibly fast. It was playing with us. My hands were slick with a mixture of sweat and rain, the grip of my pistol feeling slippery and unreliable. "Show yourself!" I yelled, the words a pathetic bluff. The only answer was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Before I could process the sound, before I could even tighten my finger on the trigger, a huge, dark silhouette exploded from the bushes to my right. It wasn't an animal running on 4 legs. It was a blur of motion, a nightmare shape that moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed. It ignored me completely. In a single, fluid movement, it was on the smuggler. The man let out one last, choked shriek as a clawed hand, impossibly large and tipped with black talons, clamped over his face. The creature lifted him from the ground as if he weighed nothing, and with a sickening crunch of bone dragged him backward into the churning darkness of the woods. It was over in 2 seconds. The man was gone. The clearing was empty, save for me. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the scream. There was only the sound of the rain and my own ragged, panicked breathing. Then, from the blackness where the man had been taken, a new sound arose. A long, drawn-out howl. But it wasn't the howl of a wolf. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with a terrifying, bloodthirsty triumph that was horribly, chillingly intelligent. Fear is a physical thing. It's a cold liquid that floods your veins, paralyzing your limbs and clouding your thoughts. But rage is a fire. And as I stood there, listening to that triumphant howl, a spark of rage ignited inside me. I had to see it. I had to face the thing that had turned my forest into its personal hunting ground. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I began to walk slowly toward the bushes, my pistol shaking in my grip. "Come on, you bastard," I whispered. "Come on." I took 2 more steps, and the world erupted. Something slammed into me from the side with the force of a speeding car. The impact knocked the air from my lungs and sent me flying. I hit the ground hard, my head cracking against a rock. Stars exploded behind my eyes and my pistol flew from my grasp, skittering away into the mud and leaves. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air, my vision swimming. And then it was there, looming over me. The thing from my nightmares. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body a grotesque parody of a man and a wolf. Its frame was gaunt and wiry, covered in patches of coarse dark fur, but its skin was a leathery grayish-brown underneath. The head was the worst part. It had the elongated snout of a wolf, but the face was disturbingly primate-like, with a flattened, almost bat-like nose. Its lips were pulled back in a permanent snarl, revealing rows of long, needle-sharp fangs from which the smuggler's blood dripped onto my face. And its eyes. They were a blazing, sickly yellow, burning with a rabid, coked-up insanity. It lowered its head, its hot, foul breath washing over me. A charnel house stench of rot and blood. It opened its jaws, and I stared into the blackness of my own grave. This was it. This was how I died. My last thought was of Olivia and Chloe, their faces from the photograph on my desk. I'm sorry. Just as the creature lunged, a loud pop hiss split the air. A brilliant red light shot into the sky, trailing smoke. A flare. It burst directly overhead, bathing the clearing in a harsh, dancing crimson glare. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, agonized sound, and recoiled as if struck. It flinched away from the intense light, shielding its yellow eyes with a long, clawed arm. The light seemed to cause it physical pain. It gave me one last look of pure, seething hatred, then scrambled backward, melting into the shadows of the forest as quickly as it had appeared. The red light of the flare painted the dripping trees in demonic hues as I lay there gasping, shaking, and impossibly alive. Footsteps squelched in the mud, approaching me. A figure leaned over me, silhouetted against the dying flare. That was a close one, a calm, measured voice said. "You ought to be more careful." The man who stood over me was the last thing I expected to see in this storm-swept hell. He was tall and lean, maybe in his mid-40s, with short blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses that were somehow still perched on his nose. He was wearing practical, expensive-looking hiking gear that, despite the deluge, seemed remarkably clean. He offered me a hand. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice steady, almost academic. I took his hand, my own still trembling uncontrollably. He pulled me to my feet with surprising strength. "My head," I mumbled, touching the back of my skull. My fingers came away sticky with blood. Who are you?" "My name is Dr. Elias Vance," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. He looked past me into the darkness where the creature had vanished, a strange, calculating expression on his face. "And to answer your next question, I'm afraid my reasons for being out here are complicated." I retrieved my pistol from the mud, my mind reeling. A doctor? Out here? In the middle of this? It made no sense. "You fired that flare?" "Standard emergency practice when one finds oneself in a precarious situation," he said with a small, detached smile. "It seems it was more for your benefit than my own." Before I could demand more answers, the forest around us came alive. The click-clack of rifle bolts being chambered echoed from the trees on all sides. Powerful flashlights cut through the rain, their beams pinning us like insects. "Manos arriba! Tiren las armas!" a voice barked from the darkness. "Hands up! Drop the weapons!" Dr. Vance sighed, a sound of deep exasperation, and slowly raised his hands. I hesitated for a second, my pistol still aimed at the unseen threat, but the sight of a dozen red laser dots dancing on my chest made the decision for me. I let the Glock fall to the muddy ground. Men emerged from the trees. They weren't rangers or cops. They were dressed in mismatched camouflage gear and tactical vests, their faces hard and grim under the brims of their caps. They were all carrying Kalashnikovs, the iconic curved magazines of the AK-47S looking brutally out of place among the Oregon pines. The cartel. This had to be the rest of the crew, the main group. The flare had saved me from the monster only to deliver me to them. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, strode forward and backhanded Dr. Vance across the face, sending his glasses flying. He then turned to me. I didn't even see the rifle butt coming. A universe of white-hot pain exploded behind my eyes and the world dissolved into blackness. I came to with a throbbing, rhythmic agony in my head and the taste of blood in my mouth. I was on my side, on the damp floor of a large canvas tent. My hands were bound tightly behind my back with a zip tie that cut into my wrists. The steady drumming of rain on the tent fabric was a miserable, monotonous soundtrack to my pain. A few feet away, Dr. Vance was sitting up, also bound. His lip was split, and a dark bruise was forming on his cheek, but his expression was one of grim resignation rather than fear. Outside, I could hear voices all speaking rapid, angry Spanish. The hiss and crackle of a large campfire fought against the sound of the downpour. We were in their base camp. "Welcome back, Ranger," Vance said, his voice a low murmur. "I apologize for the rude welcome. These gentlemen are not known for their hospitality." "Who are they?" I rasped, my throat raw. "What do they want?" Vance looked at me, his eyes dark and serious in the dim light filtering through the tent flap. "They are the proprietors of the shipment you likely discovered in the plane. And as for what they want, well, right now they're trying to recover their very expensive, very volatile missing property. But as for us..." He paused, listening to a particularly heated exchange from outside. "They'll kill us," he stated, not with panic, but with a chilling, factual certainty. "They can't afford witnesses, not a park ranger, and certainly not me. We've seen too much. It's merely a question of when they get around to it." The finality in his voice was like a punch to the gut. Trapped. In a cartel camp, in the middle of a hurricane with a monster roaming the woods. My chances of seeing Olivia and Chloe again had just dwindled to zero. Despair, cold and absolute, began to settle over me. Vance saw it in my eyes. "Fear is a rational response," he said quietly, "but it is not a productive one. We are in a very bad situation. The worst, perhaps, but we are not dead yet." "That thing," I whispered. The image of the yellow-eyed creature burned into my memory. "What was it?" Vance was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I suppose, given our current life expectancy," he said with a humorless smile, "there's no longer any harm in telling the truth." "It's my fault," Dr. Vance began, his voice a low confessional murmur against the steady drumming of the rain on the tent. "All of this. The crash, the creature in the woods, it's all my fault." He shifted his weight, wincing as the zip ties bit into his wrists. "I'm not a medical doctor, Ranger. I'm a professor of ethnobotany. My specialty is the relationship between indigenous cultures and the plants they use, particularly psychoactive or sacred flora. 2 years ago, my research took me deep into the Sierra Madre Mountains in Oaxaca, Mexico. I was studying a small, uncontacted tribe, a people so isolated they were practically myth. He stared at the canvas wall of the tent as if he could see the jungle through it. They didn't worship gods of the sun or rain. Their entire cosmology, their whole system of belief, was centered on a single entity, a god that lived among them. They called it Tecolotl. He glanced at me. In the Nahuatl language, it roughly translates to night hunter. The name sent a fresh chill down my spine. According to their legends, Vance continued, Tecolotl was a shapeshifter, a guardian spirit that could walk as a man or run as a wolf. The tribe both feared and revered it. They believed it protected them from the outside world. The high priestess of the tribe, an old woman named Itzel, was the only one who could communicate with it, the only one who could control it. She invited me into their most sacred space, a sealed-off canyon that served as a temple. Vance's voice dropped even lower. It wasn't a temple built of stone and gold, Ranger. It was an arena, a pen, and inside it, I saw him. It wasn't a spirit or a myth. It was a living, breathing creature, the Tecolotl. I was stunned. It was a biological impossibility, a species completely unknown to science, a perfect apex predator. The priestess, Itzel, she called herself its mother, he explained, a flicker of something, awe perhaps, in his eyes. Not in a biological sense, of course. She found it as an infant, the last of its kind, she believed. She raised it, nurtured it. Her presence, her voice, her scent. It was the only thing that kept its primal nature in check. It was, for all intents and purposes, her son. A wave of shouting from outside the tent made us both fall silent. It sounded like an argument, fierce and desperate. When it subsided, Vance continued his story. About 3 months ago, a tragedy occurred. A sickness, probably influenza brought in by illegal loggers, swept through the village. Itzel, being very old, was one of the first to die, and without her, without his mother to soothe him, Tecolotl became unstable. The younger tribesmen who tried to feed him, to continue the rituals, were met with pure aggression. He killed 2 of them. The tribe, in their fear and grief, misinterpreted his violence. They thought their god was angry, that he was demanding a blood sacrifice. They started leaving their own people for him. Vance shook his head, a look of profound sorrow on his face. I couldn't watch it happen. I couldn't let them destroy themselves, and I couldn't let this magnificent, unique creature be a party to it. So you stole it, I said, the pieces clicking into place. I rescued it, he corrected, a defensive edge to his voice. I used my knowledge of local plants to create a powerful sedative. I tranquilized him. These men, he gestured with his head toward the sounds outside, they were smugglers I'd made contact with before, moving archaeological artifacts. For the right price, they'll move anything. I paid them to fly me and the sedated Tecolotl into the United States. My plan was to get him to a private research facility, to study him, to understand him, to protect him. He let out a long, shaky breath. The confident professor was gone, replaced by a man confessing his catastrophic failure. The flight was rough. The storm was already building. We were being bounced around, and the creature started to stir. He was agitated. One of the pilots, the one you likely found by the wreckage, he thought it would be funny. He'd been sampling the cargo. He took a small bag of the cocaine and he threw it into the cage. He wanted to see what would happen. Vance closed his eyes. his face pale. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The drug didn't calm him, it supercharged him. It sent him into a state of absolute psychotic rage. He became a force of nature. He tore through the steel bars of the cage like they were paper. The cockpit became a bloodbath. The plane went into a nosedive. It's a miracle anyone survived the crash. I did, he finished quietly. And the other pilot. We crawled from the wreckage. Tekolotl was gone, vanished into the woods, completely out of his mind. The pilot ran, and I followed him, trying to track him, hoping I could somehow fix the mess I'd made. That's when I heard your shouts. The flare. It was my last one. I was hoping to scare him off, and I suppose it worked. But it also worked as a perfect beacon for the rest of the cartel, who were already searching for their lost plane. So that was it. The whole insane story. A stolen demigod, a coked-up monster, and a well-intentioned scientist whose arrogance had unleashed a nightmare into my world. The puzzle was complete, and it was a picture of pure horror. The flap of the tent was ripped open, and two armed men stormed in. They grabbed Vance and me, hauling us roughly to our feet. The pain in my head flared, sharp and blinding. They shoved us out of the tent and into the maelstrom. The camp was a chaotic scene carved out of the dark woods. A large, sputtering bonfire roared under a makeshift tarp, casting wild, dancing shadows. Around it, maybe 8 or 9 men were gathered, their faces grim and anxious in the firelight, their automatic rifles held at the ready. The air was thick with the smell of wet canvas, wood smoke, and fear. They dragged us toward the fire and threw us onto our knees in the mud before a man who was clearly the leader. He was older than the others, with cold, calculating eyes and a silver and turquoise ring on his finger. He took a long drag from a cigarette and looked us over like we were insects. He started questioning Vance in rapid-fire Spanish, his voice low and menacing. Vance answered calmly, his Spanish seemingly fluent, but the leader was not satisfied. He grew more agitated, gesturing wildly toward the dark forest. My eyes scanned the faces of the men around the fire, my mind desperately searching for an escape route, a weakness, any sliver of hope. And then I saw him. He was standing slightly apart from the others near the edge of the firelight, his rain-soaked ranger jacket zipped up to his chin. His face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted. He looked utterly out of place amongst the hardened criminals. It was Finn. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My breath caught in my throat. Finn, my partner, here, with them. The puzzle wasn't complete. There had been one more piece, a piece I never could have imagined. It clicked into place with a sickening finality. The gambling debts, the desperation, the reason this cartel had been able to operate undetected in our park. They had an inside man. They had Finn. He wasn't just in debt, he was owned. He'd been feeding them information about our patrols, about the blind spots in our radio coverage, about the quietest sectors. He had sold us out. He had sold me out. Our eyes met across the fire. I saw a universe of guilt and shame in his gaze. He looked away, unable to hold my stare. The leader finished with Vance and turned his cold eyes on me. "Y tú, el guardabosques," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "And you?" "The ranger." He switched to heavily accented but clear English. "Your friend here says you are alone. Is this true?" I stared at him, my mouth dry, my mind a vortex of betrayal and rage. I couldn't speak. I just glared at him, then let my eyes drift back to Finn. The leader followed my gaze. He smirked, a cruel, knowing expression. "Ah," he said. "You see, we have A consultant. Finn flinched as if struck. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Jefe, listen," he said, his voice thin and shaky. "He's a good man. Cal's a good man. We can leave him. Tie him up. The storm, no one will find him for days. We'll be long gone." The leader laughed, a short, ugly bark. He turned back to me. "Your partner has a soft heart. It is a weakness in our business." Finn looked at me then, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Cal," he whispered, the words barely carrying over the roar of the fire. "I was in deep, so deep. They were going to. I didn't have a choice. I tried to keep you out of it. When Marcus gave us Gamma, I told them to stay clear. I swear." I said nothing. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest, so heavy I could barely breathe. My partner. The man whose back I was supposed to have and who was supposed to have mine. The leader tired of the drama. "We have no time for this. The beast is still out there, and we are leaving. Witnesses are a liability." He raised his pistol, a nickel-plated semi-automatic that glinted in the firelight, and aimed it squarely at Dr. Vance's forehead. "No!" Finn shouted, taking another step forward. The leader ignored him. "Adios, Professor," he sneered. The gunshot was deafening. Dr. Elias Vance was thrown backward, a neat dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He landed in the mud with a wet thud and lay still, his story finished forever. The leader swung the pistol toward me. My time was up. I closed my eyes, a final image of Olivia and Chloe flashing in my mind. This was it. The end. As the cartel leader's cold eyes met mine over the barrel of his pistol, a sound tore through the night that made the gunshot seem like a firecracker. It was a howl of pure, drug-fueled fury, so close it felt like it was inside my own head. It wasn't the triumphant cry I'd heard before. This was a shriek of absolute rage and pain. All heads snapped toward the tree line. And then it came. Tecolotl burst from the darkness, not as a stealthy predator, but as an engine of pure destruction. It crashed through the undergrowth and into the firelight, a 7-foot-tall whirlwind of matted fur, claws, and teeth. Its yellow eyes burned with an unholy light, and foam flecked with blood dripped from its snarling jaws. It was no longer hunting. It was rampaging. Chaos erupted. The camp dissolved into a maelstrom of panic and violence. The cartel men, hardened killers moments before, screamed like children. They opened fire, the frantic chatter of their AK-47s deafening. Bullets ripped through the air, tearing through tents, thudding into trees, and finding unintended targets in the confusion. The creature was a blur of motion, impossibly fast and brutally efficient. It leaped onto one of the men, and the man's screams were cut short with a wet, tearing sound. It swatted another with a backhand blow that sent him flying into the bonfire, his camouflage gear igniting in a horrific plume of flame. It was a slaughter. The monster wasn't distinguishing between enemies. It was simply attacking the noise, the lights, the movement. In the midst of the pandemonium, I felt a tug at my wrists. I looked down and saw Finn kneeling beside me, his face ashen, fumbling with a pocket knife to saw through my zip tie. "I'm so sorry, Cal," he gasped, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the knife. "I never wanted this." The plastic restraint snapped free. "Go!" he yelled, shoving me. "Get out of here! Run!" I scrambled backward on all fours, my newly freed hands sinking into the mud. I watched as the Tecolotl disemboweled another smuggler with a single swipe of its claws. The leader, the man with the silver ring, stood his ground, emptying his pistol at the creature. The bullet seemed to have no effect, striking its hide with dull thuds. The creature lunged, its massive jaws closing around the man's head with a sickening crunch. I had to get out. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs wobbly and weak. I started to turn, to flee into the relative safety of the dark woods. That's when I saw Finn go down. He wasn't attacked by the monster. A stray bullet, fired by one of his own panicked associates, caught him high in the chest. He staggered backward with a look of stunned surprise, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his ranger jacket. He collapsed to the ground not 10 feet from where I stood. Something broke inside me. Despite the betrayal, despite everything, he was my partner. I lurched toward him, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet carrying me to his side. I knelt beside him in the bloody mud. The air was filled with screams, gunfire, and the guttural roars of the monster. Finn's eyes were wide, staring up at the storm-racked sky. Blood bubbled on his lips. He grabbed the front of my shirt with a hand that was already losing its strength. He pulled me close, his gaze locking with mine. The guilt was gone, replaced by a desperate urgency. "Run, Cal," he rasped, his voice a wet, rattling whisper. "Get home, to them, run." His grip loosened, the light in his eyes faded, his hand fell away, and he was gone. The death of my friend, my betrayer, shocked me out of my paralysis. His last words were a command, a final act of penance. I stood up, leaving his body behind in that muddy, blood-soaked clearing. I turned my back on the cacophony of the slaughter, on the monster and the men it was tearing to pieces. I didn't look back. I just ran. I plunged into the black, howling wilderness. My heart a leaden weight in my chest, my lungs burning, fueled only by Finn's last words and the image of my family's faces. I ran from the hell that had swallowed the Umpqua National Forest. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. I stumbled through the darkness, guided by nothing but a primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between me and that clearing. Eventually, by sheer dumb luck, I blundered out of the trees and onto the hard-packed gravel of a Forest Service road. I collapsed right there, my body finally giving out. That's where they found me. A search and rescue team, dispatched by Marcus after Finn and I had been silent for too long. The sight of their flashing red and blue lights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. They wrapped me in blankets, loaded me into an ambulance, and took me away from the forest. The aftermath was a bureaucratic storm. The FBI got involved. They found the camp, or what was left of it, the bodies of the cartel members, Dr. Vance, the wreckage of the plane. It all corroborated my story up to a point. They found Finn's body, too. The official report listed his death as a casualty of a violent encounter between rival drug trafficking organizations. My partner got a hero's funeral, cited for dying in the line of duty while investigating the cartel's activity. I never corrected the record. It was the only gift I could give him. As for the creature, the Techolotl, it was never mentioned in any official document. The horrific wounds on the bodies were attributed to unusually aggressive bear or cougar activity, likely agitated by the storm. It was cleaner that way, simpler. No one wanted to open a file on a monster. It was easier to pretend it didn't exist. I quit the Park Service a week after I got out of the hospital. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't look at those trees without hearing the screams, without seeing Finn's face, without feeling the hot breath of that thing on my skin. Olivia and I packed up our lives and moved out of Oregon for good. We needed a fresh start, somewhere flat and wide open, somewhere without deep, dark woods. A few weeks later, before we left, I did one last thing. I drove the old highway that skirted the edge of the Umpqua National Forest. I pulled over at a scenic viewpoint and got out of the car. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the endless sea of green, the silent, imposing peaks of the Douglas firs stretching to the horizon under a clear autumn sky. It looked so peaceful, so beautiful, a perfect lie. I was about to get back in the car, to leave this place and its ghosts behind me forever, when a sound drifted out from the deep woods. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. A long, lonely, echoing howl. It wasn't the sound of a wolf, and it wasn't the call of a coyote. It was a sound of ancient hunger and profound solitude. A sound I knew I would hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. He had survived. The Techolotl. He was still out there, a living, breathing god of death. Now the permanent, secret king of that vast wilderness. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back, carrying the heavy knowledge that some echoes never fade, and that true darkness doesn't just live in the shadows, but breathes under the silent, watchful canopy of the trees.